Welcome to the Sleep Scholar. Tonight, we'll explore a quiet corner of history together. Settle in, close your eyes, and let these gentle facts carry you into deep sleep. The origins of the medieval court jester trace back to antiquity, though the specific role we associate with medieval courts developed gradually over several centuries. Historians believe that the earliest forms of professional entertainment at royal courts can be found in the ancient civilizations of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, where various performers served pharaohs, emperors, and wealthy patricians. These early entertainers, known by different names across cultures, established the foundational concept of a dedicated individual whose primary function was to provide amusement to those in positions of power. The transition from these ancient entertainers to what we recognize as the medieval court jester began approximately in the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Roman Empire declined and various Germanic tribes established new kingdoms across Europe. During this period of political fragmentation and cultural transformation, the role of court entertainers evolved to meet the needs of emerging feudal societies. Records indicate that by the 8th century, Charlemagne's court included various types of performers, though they had not yet developed into the sophisticated jester role that would emerge in later centuries. The etymology of the word jester itself provides insight into the evolution of this profession. The term derives from the Old French word jester, which originally referred to a storyteller or reciter of deeds. This French term was closely related to the Latin gesta, meaning deeds or actions, particularly heroic ones. Over time, the meaning of jester expanded to include not just those who recited heroic tales, but also those who performed various forms of entertainment at court. By the 13th century, the Middle English term gesteur had emerged, which eventually evolved into the modern English word jester. The development of the jester role was significantly influenced by the broader cultural and social changes occurring throughout medieval Europe. As feudalism became more established during the 9th and 10th centuries, royal courts grew in size and complexity. Kings and nobles required not only military advisors and administrative officials, but also individuals who could provide entertainment and relief from the serious business of governance. The jester filled this need, serving as a permanent member of the household whose duties extended beyond simple entertainment to include subtle social commentary and even political advice. Medieval chroniclers and court records from various European kingdoms provide evidence of jesters operating in different capacities across the continent. In England, court records from the reign of Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, mention payments made to various entertainers, including individuals who would later be recognized as fulfilling jester-like roles. Similarly, French court documents from the reign of Philip Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223, reference entertainers who possessed the wit and intellectual capacity that became characteristic of the mature jester profession. The social position of medieval court jesters was unique and somewhat paradoxical within the rigid hierarchical structure of feudal society. While they were technically servants of the nobility, their role granted them certain privileges and freedoms that were unavailable to other members of the lower social orders. Jesters were often permitted to speak truths and offer criticisms that would be considered treasonous if uttered by anyone else. This special status developed gradually over time and was never formalized in any legal sense, but rather emerged from the practical needs of rulers who required honest counsel delivered in a palatable format. The geographical spread of court jesters throughout medieval Europe followed patterns of political and cultural exchange. From their early development in the Frankish courts of what is now France, the institution of the court jester spread eastward into the Germanic territories of the Holy Roman Empire and northward into England following the Norman conquest of 1066. Italian city-states of the later medieval period also adopted similar traditions, though they often incorporated elements from the classical Roman traditions of entertainment that had persisted in some form throughout the early medieval period. Documentary evidence suggests that by the 12th century, the role of court jester had become sufficiently established that specific individuals could build reputations that extended beyond their immediate court environment. One of the earliest named jesters for whom we have reliable historical records is Roland Le Pétour, who served at the court of Henry II of England. Le Pétour, whose name suggests a performer of crude physical comedy, held land in Suffolk in exchange for his service as royal entertainer, demonstrating that even in the 12th century, successful jesters could achieve significant material rewards for their service. The evolution of the jester's costume and appearance also reflects the gradual development of the profession during the medieval period. Early court entertainers likely wore whatever clothing was available to them, but as the role became more formalized, distinctive elements of dress emerged. The pointed cap with bells, the motley clothing of mixed colors and patterns, and the mock scepter or bauble all developed over time as visual symbols of the jester's unique position within court society. These costume elements served both practical and symbolic functions, immediately identifying the wearer as someone operating outside normal social conventions, while simultaneously marking them as harmless entertainers. The intellectual requirements for successful court jesters distinguish them from other types of medieval entertainers such as minstrels, troubadours, or simple acrobats. While physical comedy and entertainment skills were certainly important, the most successful jesters possessed quick wit, extensive knowledge of current events, and the ability to navigate complex political situations. They needed to understand the personalities and relationships of court members, the broader political context in which their patrons operated, and the subtle art of delivering criticism or advice in ways that would be received favorably rather than perceived as threats. Training for the jester profession appears to have been informal during most of the medieval period, with aspiring entertainers learning their craft through apprenticeship arrangements or simply through observation and practice. Unlike other medieval professions that developed guild structures and formal training programs, the jester profession remained largely unregulated and individualistic. This lack of formal structure may have contributed to the wide variation in jester roles and capabilities across different courts and time periods. The relationship between medieval court jesters and the broader tradition of folk entertainment provides another important context for understanding their origins. Many historians believe the court jesters represented a formalization and elevation of entertainment traditions that existed at all levels of medieval society. Village festivals, religious celebrations, and seasonal observances all included various forms of comedy, satire, and entertainment. The court jester can be seen as a professional refinement of these popular traditions, adapted to serve the specific needs and expectations of noble audiences. Religious influences on the development of the court jester tradition were complex and sometimes contradictory. The Christian Church generally disapproved of various forms of entertainment and performance, viewing them as potentially sinful distractions from spiritual concerns. However, the Church also maintained its own traditions of religious drama and moral instruction that sometimes incorporated elements of comedy and entertainment. Some scholars suggest that certain aspects of jester performance, particularly the use of humor to convey moral lessons, may have been influenced by ecclesiastical traditions of teaching through entertainment. The economic aspects of the jester profession varied considerably, depending on the time period, location, and specific court in question. Some jesters received regular wages as permanent household members, while others operated more as freelance entertainers who traveled from court to court seeking employment. The most successful jesters could accumulate considerable wealth and property, while others remained dependent on the generosity of their patrons for basic survival. Court records from various medieval kingdoms show payments to jesters ranging from small daily allowances to substantial grants of land and property. Documentation of specific jester performances and activities becomes more detailed as the medieval period progressed and record-keeping practices improved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, court chronicles and household accounts provide increasingly rich descriptions of jester activities, their relationships with their patrons, and their roles in significant historical events. These later medieval sources help historians understand not only how the jester profession had evolved by that time, but also provide insight into earlier practices and traditions that may not have been as thoroughly documented. The distinction between court jesters and other types of medieval entertainers became more pronounced as the profession matured. While minstrels focused primarily on musical performance and storytelling, and while acrobats and other physical performers emphasized athletic skills, jesters developed a unique combination of verbal wit, physical comedy, and social commentary that set them apart from their contemporaries. This specialization allowed the most talented individuals to develop distinctive personal styles and reputations that could command premium compensation and preferred treatment at the most prestigious courts. This elevated status, however, came with a complex web of legal obligations and social restrictions that varied considerably across different kingdoms and time periods. The legal framework governing jesters in medieval Europe was neither uniform nor consistently documented, yet surviving court records from the 12th through 15th centuries reveal a fascinating pattern of privileges and constraints that defined their unique position within the rigid social hierarchy of the time. In the court of Henry II of England, who reigned from 1154 to 1189, we find some of the earliest detailed records of jester compensation and legal status. The royal jester known as Roland le Farter, whose name appears in the pipe rolls of 1184, held his position not merely as an entertainer, but as a recognized court officer with specific duties outlined in formal documentation. Historical records indicate that Roland received an annual payment of 30 shillings, along with provisions of clothing appropriate to his station, including the distinctive motley garments that would become synonymous with the jester's role. More significantly, these same records show that he held tenure of land in Hemingston, Suffolk, granted specifically in exchange for his obligation to perform before the king annually, demonstrating that jesters could achieve a form of feudal status typically reserved for knights and nobles. The legal concept of sergeanty by grand service applied to several court jesters of this period, meaning they held their positions and accompanying benefits through formal feudal contracts rather than mere employment agreements. This distinction was crucial in medieval legal systems, as it provided jesters with certain protections and rights that ordinary servants could not claim. The jester Berengarius, who served at the court of King John from approximately 1199 to 1216, appears in contemporary chronicles not merely as an entertainer, but as a holder of specific legal privileges, including the right to appeal directly to the crown in matters of personal dispute and exemption from certain local taxes and levies that affected other court personnel. The social hierarchy within which jesters operated was remarkably nuanced, positioning them in a liminal space that historians have long found challenging to categorize precisely. Unlike minstrels, who typically occupied the lower rungs of court society and were often grouped with other traveling performers of questionable social standing, successful jesters could achieve what medieval legal documents term familiaris status. That is, they became recognized members of the royal household with accompanying rights and responsibilities. This elevated position is documented in the household rolls of Edward I, who ruled England from 1272 to 1307, where his jester Goliath is listed among the permanent court officials, receiving not only regular wages but also winter and summer robes, daily meals at the royal table, and lodging within the castle precincts. The legal protections afforded to jesters were particularly significant given the potentially dangerous nature of their profession. Court records from the French court of Philip IV, who reigned from 1285 to 1314, include several instances where royal jesters faced accusations of treason or lèse-majesté for comments made during their performances. However, these same records reveal the existence of what legal historians term the privilege of folly, a recognized legal concept that provided jesters with greater latitude for controversial speech than was permitted to other court members. The jester Taillefer, who served at Philip's court from approximately 1290 to 1310, was formally accused of seditious speech in 1304 after making pointed comments about the king's financial policies. Yet court documents show that these charges were ultimately dismissed specifically because of his status as a professional fool, whose words were deemed to carry less weight and threat than those of ordinary courtiers. This legal protection, however, was far from absolute and varied significantly, depending on the temperament of individual rulers and the specific political circumstances of the time. The boundaries of acceptable jester behavior were constantly negotiated and renegotiated, often through trial and error that could have serious consequences for the performers involved. Records from the court of Richard II of England, who ruled from 1377 to 1399, document several instances where jesters overstepped these invisible boundaries, including the case of one William Sommers, who was temporarily banished from court in 1385 for making jokes that, too, closely resembled actual criticism of the king's handling of peasant uprisings. The economic aspects of jester employment reveal additional complexities in their social and legal status. Unlike most medieval professions, which were regulated by guild systems that established standardized wages, training requirements, and working conditions, jesters operated largely outside these traditional structures. This independence provided them with greater flexibility in negotiating their terms of employment, but also left them more vulnerable to the arbitrary decisions of their patrons. Court account books from the Burgundian court under Philip the Good, who ruled from 1419 to 1467, show that the court jester Jean Le Fol received not only his regular stipend but also occasional bonus payments tied to specific performances or successful entertainments of visiting dignitaries, suggesting a more complex compensation structure than was typical for most court positions. The legal status of jesters also extended to matters of marriage and family life, areas where medieval law typically restricted the freedoms of those in service to noble households. Evidence from various European courts indicates that successful jesters often enjoyed greater autonomy in personal matters than other court servants. The marriage contract of Henri Le Fol, jester to Charles V of France from approximately 1364 to 1380, survives in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale and reveals that he was permitted to marry without seeking royal permission, a privilege typically reserved for higher-ranking court officials. Furthermore, the contract indicates that his wife was granted certain privileges at court, including the right to reside in the castle and receive provisions during her husband's periods of service. The question of social mobility through the jester profession represents one of the most intriguing aspects of their position within medieval hierarchy. While most medieval occupations offered limited opportunities for advancement beyond one's birth status, the jester's role could occasionally serve as a pathway to higher social standing. Historical records document several instances of jesters who parlayed their court positions into more prestigious roles or accumulated sufficient wealth to purchase land and establish themselves as minor nobility. The case of Archibald Armstrong, who served as court jester to James I of England and later to Charles I, illustrates this potential for advancement. Armstrong, who began his career as a member of the minor gentry, used his position to accumulate substantial wealth and influence, eventually receiving a knighthood in 1617, though this occurred slightly beyond the traditional medieval period. The legal immunities enjoyed by jesters extended beyond matters of speech to include certain protections in civil disputes and criminal proceedings. Court records from the Holy Roman Empire during the 14th and 15th centuries contain numerous examples of jesters invoking their special status to avoid prosecution for minor offences or to seek royal intervention in local legal matters. The jester Klaus Narr, who served Frederick III from approximately 1452 to 1470, appears in imperial legal documents as both defendant and plaintiff in various proceedings, consistently citing his position as grounds for transferring cases from local courts to imperial jurisdiction, where he presumably expected more favorable treatment. However, this elevated legal status came with corresponding obligations that distinguished jesters from other entertainers and court servants. Medieval legal codes, where they address the jester's role specifically, emphasize the concept of exclusive service and loyalty. The jester's contract with his patron typically included clauses prohibiting performance for rival courts or engagement in political activities that might compromise his loyalty. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in England in 1351, specifically exempted court jesters from its general provisions restricting worker mobility. But this exemption came with the understanding that jesters owed absolute fidelity to their patrons and could not simply abandon their positions to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The inheritance of jester positions presents another fascinating aspect of their legal status. Unlike most medieval offices, which were either hereditary by right or filled through appointment, jester positions occupied a middle ground that varied considerably across different courts and time periods. Some positions did pass from father to son, suggesting a form of hereditary right, while others were treated as purely personal appointments that terminated with the death or dismissal of the individual jester. The family of jesters serving the Dukes of Brittany from the late 13th through early 15th centuries provides an excellent example of hereditary succession, with court records showing 3 generations of the same family holding the position of ducal fool, each inheriting not only the role, but also the associated land grants and legal privileges. The relationship between jesters and the church represents another crucial aspect of their legal and social position. Medieval canon, law, which governed many aspects of daily life, generally took a dim view of theatrical performers and entertainers, often grouping them with other morally suspect professions. However, court jesters, by virtue of their elevated status and royal patronage, often escaped the worst of these restrictions. Several papal documents from the 14th century specifically address the status of court jesters, generally concluding that their service to legitimate rulers exempted them from the broader ecclesiastical prohibitions affecting other types of performers. The jester Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube, who served at the papal court in Avignon during the 1370s, represents the ultimate acceptance of the jester's profession by religious authorities, as his appointment by Pope Gregory XI demonstrated that even the highest levels of the Church could embrace the value of professional fools when their services were properly channeled and controlled. This institutional acceptance by both secular and religious authorities fundamentally shaped the daily existence of court jesters, determining not only their professional obligations, but also their living arrangements, social interactions, and the rhythmic patterns that governed their everyday lives within the complex hierarchies of medieval courts. The jester's position, while privileged in certain respects, remained carefully regulated through established routines that reflected the broader organizational structures of courtly life during the 13th through 15th centuries. The typical day for a court jester began well before dawn, often around the 4th hour after midnight, according to the canonical hours that structured medieval timekeeping. Records from the court of Edward III of England, dating to approximately 1347, indicate that the royal jester Will Sommers was expected to attend the king's private chapel for morning prayers, though he was permitted to stand at the rear of the chamber rather than kneel with the other courtiers. This arrangement, documented in the household accounts preserved in the National Archives, demonstrates how jesters occupied a unique position within the religious observances that began each courtly day. Similar arrangements existed at the court of Philip IV of France, where the Jester Helias de Bourcelin was recorded as receiving a daily allowance of bread and ale, specifically for consumption before the morning devotions that commenced at sunrise. Following these early religious obligations, jesters typically attended to their personal grooming and the maintenance of their distinctive costumes, tasks that required considerable time and attention, given the elaborate nature of their professional attire. The wardrobe accounts from the court of Richard II, preserved in the Exchequer rolls for the years 1389 to 1394, reveal that the royal jester was allocated specific time each morning for the adjustment and repair of his parti-colored clothing, bells, and other accoutrements. These garments, which often featured contrasting colors such as red and yellow or blue and green, arranged in complex patterns, required daily maintenance to preserve their visual impact and symbolic significance within the court's carefully orchestrated displays of status, no hierarchy. The primary working hours for court jesters typically commenced during the second meal of the day, which in most medieval courts occurred around the 9th hour of morning according to contemporary timekeeping practices. During this period, jesters were expected to provide entertainment during the formal dining rituals that occupied much of the courtly day. The Libri Memoriali of the papal court at Avignon, compiled during the pontificate of Clement VI between 1342 and 1352, describe how the papal jester Johannes Presbyter was required to perform specific routines during each course of the elaborate meals that could extend for 3 to 4 hours. These performances included not only humorous speeches and physical comedy, but also the recitation of moral verses and the delivery of satirical commentary on current events. all carefully calibrated to the dining protocols that governed papal hospitality. At secular courts, similar patterns prevailed, though with variations that reflected local customs and the personal preferences of individual rulers. The court records of Louis XI of France, maintained by the royal secretaries between 1461 and 1483, document how the king's jester Cailliet was assigned specific duties during the elaborate dinner ceremonies that served as both social and political events. These duties included the announcement of each course, the entertainment of visiting dignitaries during the intervals between servings, and the performance of brief dramatic sketches that often incorporated references to current diplomatic negotiations or military campaigns. The jester's role in these contexts extended beyond mere entertainment to encompass subtle forms of political communication that could convey messages too sensitive for direct expression through conventional diplomatic channels. The afternoon hours typically brought different responsibilities, as jesters were often called upon to attend private audiences and intimate gatherings where their skills in conversation and wit were particularly valued. Records from the court of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, dating to the 1470s, indicate that his jester, Le Glorieux, regularly participated in the Duke's private consultations with advisors, where his ability to offer unconventional perspectives on complex political matters proved valuable. These sessions, which might extend from the early afternoon until the evening meal, required jesters to maintain a careful balance between humor and insight, ensuring that their contributions remained both entertaining and substantive enough to justify their presence in such elevated circles. The living quarters assigned to court jesters reflected their ambiguous position within the social hierarchy of medieval courts, typically consisting of modest private chambers located near the main residential areas, but distinct from both the noble apartments and the servants' quarters. Archaeological evidence from the remains of Kenilworth Castle, which served as a primary residence for several English kings during the 14th century, suggests that the jester's accommodation consisted of a single room of approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, equipped with a small fireplace, a narrow window, and basic furnishings, including a wooden bed frame, a storage chest, and a simple table for writing and meal preparation. Similar arrangements have been documented at the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, where papal jesters were housed in chambers within the Tour des Anges, positioned strategically between the papal apartments and the quarters assigned to lower-ranking ecclesiastical officials. These living spaces, while modest by noble standards, nevertheless represented significant privilege compared to the accommodations typically provided to other court entertainers and servants. The household accounts from the court of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, preserved in the British Library's manuscript collection, reveal that his jester received an annual allowance for furnishing and maintaining his chamber that exceeded the provisions granted to most other court officials below the rank of knight. This allowance, recorded in entries dating from 1381 to 1394, included funds for the purchase of tapestries, bed linens, writing, materials, and personal items that enabled jesters to maintain a standard of living appropriate to their unique role within the courtly community. The daily maintenance of these living quarters followed patterns that reflected both practical necessities and symbolic considerations related to the jester's professional identity. Records from the court of René d'Anjou, dating to the mid-15th century, describe how his jester's chamber was cleaned and prepared each morning by designated servants who were specifically instructed to arrange the jester's various costumes, props, and performance materials in particular configurations that would facilitate quick changes of attire and character throughout the day. These arrangements, documented in the household ordinances preserved in the Archives départementales des Bouches-du-Rhône, demonstrate the degree of institutional support that surrounded the jester's daily activities and the recognition of their professional needs within the broader organization of court life. The evening hours brought additional responsibilities that extended well beyond the conclusion of formal court activities, as jesters were frequently called upon to provide private entertainment for their patrons and to participate in the informal social gatherings that played crucial roles in medieval court culture. The diary of Olivier de la Marche, chronicler at the Burgundian court during the reign of Charles the Bold, contains numerous references to after-dinner entertainments where the ducal jester performed intimate comedic routines for small groups of nobles and distinguished visitors. These performances, which often continued until well past midnight, required jesters to maintain their wit and energy despite the exhausting schedule of duties that had occupied the preceding hours of each day. The social interactions that characterized these evening gatherings represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of the jester's daily routine, as they required the careful navigation of complex interpersonal dynamics while maintaining the delicate balance between familiarity and respect that defined their relationships with their noble patrons. The fabrics employed in jester costumes were typically imported from Flemish textile centres, particularly Bruges and Ghent, where specialized weavers produced the bright-colored woolens and linens that could withstand the physical demands of acrobatic performance, while maintaining their vibrant appearance throughout extended periods of use. Historians have noted that the durability requirements for jester clothing necessitated specific weaving techniques and dye processes that were more costly than those used for conventional court attire. Beyond the basic tunic and cap, the jester's material culture included a variety of specialized props and implements that enhanced comedic performances and facilitated interaction with court audiences. The most commonly documented of these items was the marotte, a wooden staff topped with a carved head that served as both a comedic prop and a symbol of the jester's licensed authority to speak freely within the court environment. Surviving examples of marottes from the 14th and 15th centuries, housed in collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Musée de Cluny, demonstrate considerable variation in their construction and ornamentation, ranging from simple carved wooden figures to elaborate creations incorporating painted features, miniature caps with bells, and movable jaw mechanisms. Contemporary accounts from the court of Alfonso XI of Castile dating to approximately 1325, describe jesters employing inflated pig bladders attached to wooden handles as percussion instruments and comedic props during feast performances. These bladders, known as follies in Latin sources, were prepared using traditional butchering techniques and treated with salt and various oils to ensure flexibility and durability. The rhythmic slapping sounds produced by these implements provided musical accompaniment to satirical songs and served as attention-getting devices during crowded banquet presentations. Archaeological excavations at Conwy Castle in Wales have recovered wooden handles believed to have been used for such purposes, dating to the late 13th century during the reign of Edward I. The acquisition and care of musical instruments represented another significant component of the jester's material requirements, with household records indicating that professional entertainers typically owned small harps, drums, flutes, and various percussion devices. Inventories from the court of John II of France, compiled following his capture at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, list among the royal household effects 3 small harps belonging to court jesters, valued at a total of 8 gold écus. These instruments were typically manufactured by specialized craftsmen in urban centers, such as Paris, London, and Florence, where guild regulations established quality standards for court entertainment equipment. The storage and transportation of jester equipment required specialized containers and organizational systems, particularly for courts that traveled frequently between various royal residences. Account books from the household of Edward III describe the construction of wooden chests lined with wool felt, designed specifically for the secure transport of jester costumes and props during royal progresses between Windsor, Westminster, and other royal establishments. These containers, manufactured by court carpenters using oak harvested from royal forests, featured iron reinforcements and lock mechanisms to protect valuable costume elements during extended journeys across medieval road networks. Documentation suggests that the replacement and repair of jester equipment followed regular schedules, with major costume overhauls typically occurring during the Christmas season, when courts remain stationary for extended periods. Household accounts from the court of Charles VI of France, dating to the 1380s, record payments to specialized seamstresses and tailors for the annual refurbishment of jester clothing, including the replacement of bells, the re-dyeing of faded fabrics, and the repair of wear damage sustained during the previous year's performances. These maintenance activities were coordinated by household officials who maintained detailed inventories of jester equipment and monitored its condition throughout the year. The symbolic significance of jester material culture extended beyond mere functional considerations, encompassing complex systems of meaning that reinforced social hierarchies while simultaneously providing commentary upon them. Historians have observed that the exaggerated features and deliberately impractical design elements of jester costumes serve to mark their wearers as existing outside normal social categories, creating a liminal space within which conventional rules of behavior could be temporarily suspended. The bells, bright colors, and asymmetrical design patterns that characterized jester attire communicated specific messages about the wearer's social position and behavioral expectations to medieval audiences familiar with these symbolic conventions. Regional variations in jester material culture reflect broader patterns of cultural exchange and local manufacturing traditions throughout medieval Europe. Evidence from Italian court records, particularly those maintained at the papal court in Avignon during the 14th century, indicates that Mediterranean jesters employed different color schemes and costume designs compared to their northern European counterparts. These variations typically reflected local textile traditions and the availability of specific dye materials, with Italian jesters favoring combinations of gold and crimson that utilize saffron and cochineal dyes readily available through Mediterranean trade networks. The economic networks that supported jester material culture connected royal courts to specialized craftsmen and suppliers across medieval Europe, creating demand for luxury items and specialized services that contributed to urban commercial development. Guild records from London dating to the reign of Henry IV document the existence of specialized fool wrights who manufactured jester props and maintained costumes for court entertainers. These craftsmen typically worked in close proximity to other luxury trades, clustering in urban districts alongside goldsmiths, silk merchants, and other artisans who served aristocratic clientele. Contemporary moralists and religious writers frequently criticized the elaborate nature of jester costumes and the expense associated with their maintenance, viewing such expenditures as symptomatic of courtly excess and moral corruption. The Franciscan chronicler Salim Bene de Adam, writing in the late 13th century, specifically condemned the practice of adorning court entertainers with costly fabrics and precious metals, arguing that such displays represented inappropriate allocations of resources that could be better directed toward charitable purposes or religious institutions. The preservation of historical jester costumes and props present significant challenges for modern scholars, as the materials typically employed in their construction were particularly susceptible to decay and damage over extended periods. The organic nature of wool, linen, and leather components, combined with the intensive use these items received during their active service periods, means that surviving examples are extremely rare and often fragmentary. Most contemporary knowledge of jester material culture derives from written descriptions, artistic representations, and occasional archaeological discoveries, rather than complete surviving costume ensembles. Recent scholarly analysis of illuminated manuscripts and painted panels from the 14th and 15th centuries has revealed previously unrecognized details about jester material culture, including the use of specific ornamental techniques and the incorporation of symbolic elements derived from heraldic traditions. The detailed marginal illustrations found in manuscripts such as the Queen Mary Psalter and the Luttrell Psalter provide visual documentation of jester costumes and props that complements the written evidence preserved in household accounts and inventory records. The seasonal variation in jester costume requirements reflected both practical considerations related to climate and ceremonial demands, associated with specific calendar observances throughout the medieval year. Winter costumes typically incorporated additional layers and heavier fabrics, while summer attire emphasized lighter materials that would remain comfortable during outdoor performances in castle courtyards and garden settings. Special costume elements were often commissioned for major religious festivals, particularly Christmas and Easter celebrations, when jesters played expanded roles in court entertainment programs that could extend over multiple days or weeks. These seasonal costume variations served as more than mere practical considerations, as they formed the foundation for the jester's sophisticated repertoire of performance techniques that evolved considerably throughout the medieval period. Historical records from the court of King Henry II of England, dating to approximately 1170, describe how the royal jester Roland le Farceur would modify not only his clothing, but his entire performance style according to the seasonal demands of court life. During the winter months, when the court remained largely confined to interior spaces, jesters developed what contemporary chroniclers termed chamber performances, intimate entertainment techniques specifically designed for the smaller, more confined audiences typical of great halls and private chambers during the cold season. The art of medieval court entertainment required jesters to master an extensive range of performance skills that went far beyond simple joke-telling or physical comedy. Documentation from the court records of Louis VII of France, preserved in the Archives Nationales and dating to the mid-12th century, reveals that accomplished jesters were expected to demonstrate competency in at least 7 distinct areas of entertainment. These included musical performance on various instruments, particularly the lute, psaltery, and small drums, storytelling, and recitation of both sacred and secular narratives, physical comedy and acrobatic demonstrations, riddle posing and wordplay, musical composition and lyric writing, mimicry and character impersonation, and what medieval sources describe as the art of wise foolishness, the ability to deliver social commentary through seemingly innocent entertainment. Musical performance represented perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of a jester's repertoire, requiring years of dedicated study and practice. Court records from the Holy Roman Empire during the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, approximately 1155 to 1190, indicate that imperial jesters underwent formal musical training comparable to that received by court minstrels and troubadours. The jester Heinz der Narr, documented as serving in the imperial court from 1162 to 1184, was noted by contemporary chroniclers for his ability to perform complex polyphonic compositions on the organistrum, an early form of hurdy-gurdy that required considerable technical skill to operate effectively. Historical evidence suggests that many jesters could read musical notation, a relatively rare skill in medieval society, and several are documented as having composed original musical works for court entertainment. The storytelling techniques employed by medieval jesters drew from a vast repertoire of traditional tales, contemporary events, and original compositions that reflected both popular culture and courtly interests. Manuscript evidence from the monastery of Saint-Denis, dating to approximately 1180, preserves several narrative sequences attributed to court jesters, including elaborate versions of Arthurian legends adapted specifically for humorous presentation. These performances typically incorporated multiple voices and characters, requiring jesters to develop sophisticated skills in vocal modulation and character differentiation. Contemporary accounts describe how skilled jesters could maintain narrative tension over extended periods, sometimes stretching a single story across multiple evening entertainment sessions during long winter months, when courts had limited alternative diversions. Physical comedy and acrobatic performance formed another crucial component of the jester's artistic repertoire, though historical documentation of these techniques remains somewhat limited due to their ephemeral nature. However, surviving court records from the Kingdom of Sicily under Norman rule, particularly during the reign of William II from 1166 to 1189, provide detailed accounts of the physical performance expectations placed upon court entertainers. The jester Guglielmo il Buffone, documented as serving the Sicilian court from approximately 1170 to 1195, was specifically noted for his ability to perform what contemporary sources describe as the 12 postures of folly, a standardized sequence of physical comedy routines that apparently included elements of tumbling, juggling, and elaborate pratfalls designed to amuse courtly audiences while avoiding any actions that might be considered inappropriate or undignified in royal presence. The development of riddle posing and wordplay techniques represented one of the most intellectually sophisticated aspects of medieval jester performance, requiring extensive knowledge of contemporary language, literature, and scholarly discourse. Evidence from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, preserved in various chronicle sources dating to the late 12th century, indicates that court jesters were expected to engage in elaborate verbal contests, not only with audience members, but occasionally with visiting scholars, clergy, and nobility. These performances often took the form of structured debates or riddling contests that could extend over considerable periods, demonstrating the jester's ability to think quickly while maintaining the entertainment value of the interaction. Historical records suggest that successful performance in these verbal contests could significantly enhance a jester's reputation and influence within court society. Musical composition and lyric writing formed yet another dimension of the jester's artistic responsibilities, though the boundary between jester and troubadour often became blurred in this particular area of performance. Manuscript sources from the court of Philip Augustus of France, dating to approximately 1190 to 1200, preserve several lyrical compositions attributed to the court jester Gautier Le Fol, whose works apparently combined traditional courtly love themes with satirical commentary on contemporary political events. These compositions demonstrate considerable sophistication in their use of complex rhyme schemes and metrical patterns, suggesting that at least some medieval jesters possessed advanced training in the formal techniques of courtly poetry and musical composition. The art of mimicry and character impersonation allowed jesters to provide social commentary while maintaining the protective fiction of entertainment rather than direct criticism. Chronicles from the court of King John of England, covering the period from approximately 1199 to 1216, describe how the royal jester Thomas Skelton would perform elaborate impersonations of visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and even high-ranking clergy, using exaggerated mannerisms and speech patterns to highlight perceived weaknesses or foolish behaviors. These performances required careful judgment regarding appropriate targets and acceptable levels of mockery, as jesters needed to entertain their audiences without causing serious diplomatic incidents or personal offenses that might result in punishment or dismissal from court service. Perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous aspect of the jester's performance repertoire involved what medieval sources consistently describe as the art of wise foolishness, the ability to deliver serious social, political, or moral commentary through the protective medium of seemingly innocent entertainment. Historical documentation from various European courts indicates that this technique required exceptional skill in reading audience reactions and gauging the tolerance levels of powerful patrons who might be the ultimate targets of subtle criticism. The jester's traditional immunity from punishment for critical commentary was neither absolute nor guaranteed, and surviving records document several cases where jesters faced serious consequences for performances that crossed undefined, but apparently very real boundaries of acceptable discourse. The seasonal variation in performance techniques reflected not only practical considerations of indoor versus outdoor entertainment spaces, but also the changing social dynamics of court life throughout the medieval calendar year. During the summer months, when courts often moved between various residences and engaged in outdoor activities such as hunting expeditions and military campaigns, jesters adapted their repertoires to accommodate these changed circumstances. Documentation from the court of Richard I of England suggests that jesters accompanying royal hunting parties developed specialized performance techniques suitable for outdoor venues and smaller, more informal audiences composed primarily of nobility and their immediate retinues, rather than the full court assemblies typical of winter residence periods. The technical requirements for successful jester performance varied considerably depending upon the specific court culture and the personal preferences of individual patrons, leading to the development of regional performance traditions that reflected local customs and expectations. Evidence from the courts of various German principalities during the late 12th and early 13th centuries indicates that imperial jesters were expected to demonstrate familiarity with classical Latin literature and to incorporate learned references into their performances, reflecting the scholarly interests of educated courtly audiences. In contrast, contemporary documentation from the courts of Norman Sicily suggests that jesters in that region were expected to demonstrate multilingual capabilities, performing in Latin, Norman French, and various Italian dialects, depending upon the composition of their immediate audience and the specific social context of particular entertainment occasions. This linguistic versatility was not merely an entertainment flourish, but rather served as a crucial foundation for what historians have come to understand as the jester's most delicate and dangerous professional responsibility: the provision of political commentary within the rigid hierarchical structures of medieval court society. The concept of jester's license, as documented in various administrative records from the 12th through 15th centuries, represented a carefully negotiated social contract between the entertainer and the ruling authority, one that permitted certain forms of criticism and observation that would have resulted in severe punishment if expressed by any other member of the court hierarchy. The earliest documented reference to this particular aspect of the jester's role appears in the chronicle of Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing around 1136, who describes the court fool of King Arthur as one who, alone among all courtiers, possessed the privilege to speak truth to power without fear of immediate retribution. While the Arthurian accounts must be approached with appropriate scholarly caution regarding their historical accuracy, contemporary administrative documents from the court of Henry II of England, dating from approximately 1170 to 1189, provide more concrete evidence of formalized protections afforded to court entertainers who engaged in what the records term licensed mockery of governance. The practical implementation of this license varied considerably across different medieval kingdoms and time periods, with the scope of permissible criticism often directly correlating to the political security and personal temperament of the ruling monarch. During the reign of Louis VII of France, spanning from 1137 to 1180, court records indicate that the royal jester Guillaume Le Fol was granted explicit permission to comment upon matters of taxation policy and military strategy, provided such commentary was delivered within the framework of established entertainment protocols and before audiences consisting primarily of court intimates rather than visiting dignitaries or foreign ambassadors. The boundaries of this privilege were tested most dramatically during periods of political instability or dynastic uncertainty. Historical accounts from the English court during the Civil War, known as the Anarchy, which raged from approximately 1135 to 1153, describe several instances in which court jesters found themselves in precarious positions when their political commentary was perceived as supporting one faction over another. The jester known as Hittard the Dane, who served in the court of King Stephen, was reportedly imprisoned for 3 months in 1141 after making remarks that were interpreted as favorable to the claims of Empress Matilda, though he was eventually released when his comments were reframed as general observations about the nature of legitimate succession rather than specific political endorsements. The mechanisms by which jesters delivered their political commentary required considerable skill in the arts of allegory, metaphor, and indirect reference. Medieval audiences, particularly those within court circles, were well versed in the interpretation of symbolic language and coded references, making it possible for skilled entertainers to convey complex political observations without explicitly naming individuals or specific policies. Documents from the court of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, from 1220 to 1250, describe elaborate theatrical presentations in which the court jester would assume the persona of various historical figures, using their supposed voices to comment upon contemporary political situations while maintaining the fiction that such observations originated from ancient sources rather than current analysis. The development of this tradition appears to have been influenced significantly by the broader cultural movement toward allegory that characterized much of medieval intellectual life. Just as theologians and philosophers employed allegorical interpretation in their scholarly works, court jesters adapted these same techniques for the purpose of political commentary. The influential treatise De Arte Honeste Amandi by Andreas Capellanus, completed around 1184, makes specific reference to the practice of veiled discourse employed by court entertainers, noting that such methods allowed for the discussion of sensitive political matters without the direct confrontation that might threaten the stability of court relationships. Regional variations in the application of jester's license reflected broader cultural and political differences across medieval Europe. In the Italian city-states of the 13th and 14th centuries, where political power was often more fluid and contested than in the established monarchies of Northern Europe, court entertainers frequently enjoyed broader latitude in their political commentary. Records from the court of the Visconti family in Milan, dating from approximately 1287 to 1402, indicate that the ducal jesters were not only permitted but actively encouraged to provide observations on the political activities of rival families and competing city-states, with their commentary serving as an informal but valuable source of political intelligence and analysis. The famous jester Gonella, who served at the court of Niccolo III d'Este in Ferrara during the early 15th century, represents perhaps the most well-documented example of the political commentator role within the Italian context. Contemporary accounts describe Gonella as maintaining an extensive network of contacts throughout the Italian peninsula, gathering political information that he would then incorporate into his performances in carefully coded form. The chronicler Ugo Calafini, writing in the 1470s, notes that Gonella's political observations were sufficiently astute that visiting diplomats would often attend his performances not merely for entertainment, but as a means of gathering intelligence about the political climate of the Dest court and its relationships with neighboring powers. The relationship between jester's license and the broader concept of medieval free speech has attracted considerable scholarly attention in recent decades. Historians such as Mikhail Bakhtin have argued that the ritualized nature of jester performances created temporary spaces within medieval society where normal social hierarchies could be questioned or inverted without threatening the fundamental structure of political authority. This interpretation suggests that the permission granted to jesters to engage in political commentary served a valuable social function by providing a controlled outlet for dissent and criticism that might otherwise manifest in more dangerous forms. Evidence supporting this interpretation can be found in the documented correlation between periods of restricted jester activity and subsequent political unrest. During the reign of King John of England, from 1199 to 1216, administrative records show a marked decline in payments to court entertainers and a corresponding restriction of their traditional privileges. This period coincided with increasing baronial resistance to royal authority that ultimately culminated in the signing of Magna Carta in 1215. Several contemporary chroniclers, including Roger of Wendover, suggest that the suppression of traditional outlets for political commentary may have contributed to the intensification of more direct forms of political opposition. The practical exercise of political commentary by medieval jesters required not only courage and intelligence, but also a sophisticated understanding of timing and audience. The same criticism that might be welcomed during a private dinner among court intimates could result in severe consequences if delivered in the presence of foreign dignitaries or during periods of heightened political tension. The survival of several instructional texts intended for aspiring court entertainers, including the Liber de Arte Joculatoria attributed to the 13th century writer Johannes de Garlandia, provides insight into the complex calculations required for successful political commentary within court environments. These instructional materials emphasize the importance of what they term prudent observation, recommending that entertainers carefully study the political climate, recent developments in court relationships, and the specific sensitivities of individual nobles before attempting any form of commentary that might be interpreted as criticism. The text also stressed the value of maintaining apparent neutrality while delivering observations, suggesting that the most effective political commentary often took the form of general observations about human nature or historical patterns, rather than direct criticism of specific individuals or policies. The decline of the jester's traditional role as political commentator appears to have begun during the late medieval period, coinciding with broader changes in the structure of royal administration and the emergence of more formalized diplomatic protocols. As medieval kingdoms developed increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic systems and professional diplomatic corps, the informal intelligence gathering and analysis functions traditionally performed by court jesters became less valuable to ruling authorities. Additionally, the rise of humanism and the printing press created new venues for political commentary and criticism that were less dependent upon the personal relationships and court access that had traditionally protected jester privileges. By the early Renaissance period, court entertainers were increasingly expected to focus primarily upon artistic performance rather than political observation, though isolated examples of the older tradition continued to appear sporadically throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. The transformation of the jester's role from political commentator to pure entertainer represents one aspect of the broader evolution of medieval court culture toward the more structured and ceremonial patterns that would characterize early modern European monarchy. This transformation provides the necessary historical context for examining specific individuals who exemplified various stages of the jester's evolution within medieval court society. The biographical records of particular court jesters, while often fragmentary and filtered through the perspectives of court chroniclers, offer valuable insights into both the daily realities of professional foolery and the broader social dynamics that shaped these unique positions within the medieval hierarchy. Among the earliest documented court jesters whose biographical details survive in any meaningful form is Roland le Pétour, who served in the court of Henry II of England during the latter half of the 12th century. Historical records from approximately 1170 indicate that Roland held land in Suffolk, specifically in exchange for performing what contemporary documents describe as unum saltum et siffletum et unum bambulum, essentially a jump, a whistle, and a flatulent sound annually before the king during Christmas festivities. While this might suggest a rather crude form of entertainment by modern standards, Roland's documented land holdings and the formal nature of his service contract indicate that his position carried genuine social status and economic security. The specificity of the recorded performance requirements suggest that even in this early period, the role of court entertainer involved carefully defined expectations and ritualized behaviors that went beyond spontaneous humor. More substantial biographical information exists regarding Will Sommers, who served as court jester to Henry VIII of England from approximately 1525 until the king's death in 1547. Contemporaries accounts describe Sommers as a man of unremarkable physical appearance, who possessed exceptional wit and an unusual degree of personal access to the notoriously volatile monarch. Records from the privy purse expenses show regular payments to Sommers for clothing, housing, and various personal needs, indicating his integration into the royal household's financial structure. Historians believe that Sommers originated from Shropshire and came to royal attention through Richard Fermor, a gentleman of the court, though the exact circumstances of his recruitment remain unclear. What distinguishes Sommers in the historical record is the documented evidence of his political influence and his apparent ability to comment upon sensitive court matters without suffering the consequences that befell many of Henry VIII's advisers and courtiers. Contemporary chroniclers record several instances in which Sommers successfully intervened on behalf of individuals who had fallen from royal favour, using humour and indirect commentary to influence the king's decisions. During the period surrounding Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, court records suggest that Sommers played a role in expressing popular sentiment regarding the unpopular union, though he did so through carefully constructed jokes and performances rather than direct political commentary. The case of Sommers illustrates the complex relationship between entertainment and political counsel that characterized the most successful court jesters of the Tudor period. Palace accounts from 1530 show payments to Sommers for bringing news from London, suggesting that his duties extended beyond mere entertainment to include intelligence gathering and informal diplomatic functions. This dual role required exceptional social sensitivity and political acumen, as jesters needed to balance their function as entertainers with their unofficial status as political commentators and advisors. Contrasting with the English tradition, the career of Triboulet, who served Louis XII of France from approximately 1490 to 1515, demonstrates the particular characteristics of court foolery within the French royal system. Historical documents indicate that Triboulet, whose real name was Ferial, possessed significant influence within the French court and accumulated considerable personal wealth through his position. Records from the French royal treasury show regular payments to Triboulet that exceeded those provided to many court officials of higher nominal rank, suggesting the genuine value that Louis XII placed upon his jester's services. Contemporary accounts describe Triboulet as physically diminutive, but possessed of remarkable verbal dexterity and an extensive knowledge of court politics and European affairs. Unlike many court entertainers who relied primarily upon physical comedy or musical performance, Triboulet appears to have specialized in sophisticated wordplay and political satire that required considerable education and cultural sophistication. Historians believe that his influence extended to matters of foreign policy, particularly regarding French relations with the Italian states during the period of the Italian Wars. Diplomatic correspondence from the period occasionally references Triboulet's opinions on various political matters, suggesting that his role transcended entertainment to encompass genuine advisory functions. The documentation surrounding Triboulet's career also reveals the potential dangers inherent in the jester's position, despite the theoretical protection afforded by their status as entertainers. Court records from 1507 indicate that Triboulet temporarily fell from favor, following jokes that were perceived as excessive criticism of the Queen, Claude of France. His restoration to court within several months suggests both the value that Louis XII placed upon his services and the complex negotiations that surrounded the jester's relationship with various members of the royal family. Moving into the Germanic traditions, the biographical details of Klaus Narr, who served Frederick the Wise of Saxony from approximately 1498 to 1515, provide insight into the role of court jesters within the Holy Roman Empire's more fragmented political structure. Contemporary records describe Klaus as an individual of peasant origins who demonstrated exceptional intelligence and wit that brought him to the attention of the Saxon court. Unlike jesters in the more centralized monarchies of England and France, Klaus appears to have moved between various German courts, serving different princes and electors throughout his career. The peripatetic nature of Klaus Narr's career reflects the political realities of the Holy Roman Empire, where court jesters often served as informal diplomatic messengers between various German principalities. Records from the Saxon court archives indicate that Klaus carried correspondence between Frederick the Wise and other German rulers, using his status as an entertainer to travel freely across political boundaries that might have been problematic for more formal diplomatic representatives. This function became particularly important during the early years of the Protestant Reformation, when religious and political tensions made conventional diplomatic communication increasingly difficult. Documentation from approximately 1510 shows that Klaus Narr possessed sufficient education to engage with the theological and philosophical questions that dominated German intellectual life during this period. Contemporary accounts describe conversations between Klaus and various scholars and clerics, suggesting that his role encompassed intellectual discourse as well as entertainment. This combination of functions reflects the particular characteristics of German court culture during the late medieval period, where the boundaries between entertainment, scholarship, and political commentary remained more fluid than in other European courts. The career of Jane the Fool, who served as court jester to Mary I of England from 1553 to 1558, represents one of the relatively few well-documented cases of a female court jester during the medieval period. Contemporary records indicate that Jane, whose surname does not appear in surviving documents, came to Mary's attention during the Queen's period as princess, possibly serving in some unofficial capacity before Mary's accession to the throne. Payment records from the royal household show that Jane received regular compensation comparable to that provided to other court entertainers, along with provisions for clothing and lodging within the royal palaces. The specific nature of Jane's performances and her relationship with Queen Mary provide insight into both the particular challenges faced by female entertainers in royal courts and the ways in which gender influenced the jester's traditional functions. Contemporary accounts suggest that Jane's humor focused particularly upon court gossip and social commentary rather than political satire, reflecting both the limitations placed upon female political participation and the different expectations surrounding women's public speech. However, records from Mary's reign indicate that Jane possessed significant personal access to the Queen and occasionally served as an intermediary in delicate court matters, particularly those involving relationships between Mary and her female courtiers. This suggests that even within the constraints of 16th century gender roles, female jesters could develop substantial informal influence within court hierarchies. This informal political influence, exercised by female jesters like Jane the Fool, demonstrates patterns that varied considerably across different European courts, with each region developing distinct traditions for how jesters operated within their specific cultural and political frameworks. The French court tradition, for instance, established remarkably different parameters for jester behavior compared to their English counterparts, particularly in the realm of political commentary and social mobility. French court jesters, known as fous du roi, operated within a highly codified system that emerged during the reign of Louis XI in the late 15th century. The most documented of these figures was Pierre Gringoire, who served not only as court fool but also as a recognized poet and playwright between 1475 and 1538. French records from the Archives Nationales indicate that Gringoire received an annual pension of 240 livres, significantly higher than comparable English jesters of the same period, suggesting that French courts placed greater economic value on intellectual entertainment. The French tradition emphasized literary wit and classical allusions, with jesters expected to demonstrate familiarity with Latin texts and contemporary humanist philosophy. The position of fous du roi became increasingly institutionalized under Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547. Court records from Fontainebleau show that Francis maintained up to 3 official jesters simultaneously, each assigned specific ceremonial duties during different seasons of the court calendar. The primary jester, typically called the grand faux, held responsibility for entertainment during major feast days and diplomatic receptions, while secondary jesters managed more routine court functions. This hierarchical system reflected the broader French tendency toward bureaucratic organization, even extending to entertainment roles. French jesters also enjoyed greater freedom of movement between courts compared to their counterparts in other regions. Documentary evidence from the mid-16th century shows that jesters regularly traveled between the royal court and the courts of major nobles, like the Duke of Guise or the Constable of France. This mobility allowed French jesters to serve as informal messengers and intelligence gatherers, carrying news and gossip between different political centers. The practice became so common that by 1550, certain jesters were essentially functioning as semi-official diplomatic agents, though they maintained their comedic roles as protective cover for more sensitive activities. English jester traditions developed along markedly different lines, emphasizing personal relationships with monarchs rather than institutional positions within court bureaucracy. The English model, which reached its peak during the Tudor period, focused on creating intimate bonds between individual jesters and their royal patrons. Will Sommers, who served Henry VIII from approximately 1525 until the king's death in 1547, exemplifies this personalized approach. Contemporary accounts by courtiers like Edward Hall describe Sommers as having unprecedented access to the king's private chambers, often remaining present during confidential meetings with ministers and ambassadors. The English tradition also placed greater emphasis on musical performance compared to French or Germanic practices. Court payment records from the reign of Elizabeth I show regular expenditures for musical instruments specifically designated for jester use, including lutes, pipes, and small drums. Richard Tarleton, who served Elizabeth from 1583 until his death in 1588, was particularly noted for his ability to compose and perform impromptu songs that commented on current events. Surviving fragments of Tarleton's compositions, preserved in the British Library's manuscript collections, reveal sophisticated wordplay that combined political commentary with complex musical arrangements. English jesters maintained their positions through personal favor rather than formal appointment, making their status more precarious but potentially more lucrative than their continental counterparts. Payment records from the Exchequer show that successful English jesters could receive irregular but substantial rewards, including land grants and monopoly privileges. Sommers, for example, received a grant for the profitable office of Keeper of the King's Bears and Mastiffs, which provided steady income beyond his court duties. This system encouraged English jesters to develop more intimate knowledge of their monarch's personalities and preferences, leading to the highly personalized entertainment style that characterized Tudor court life. The Germanic tradition presented yet another distinct approach to court jester roles, with significant variations between different principalities and imperial courts. The Holy Roman Emperor's court in Vienna maintained jesters known as Hofnarren, who operated within the complex ceremonial protocols of imperial administration. Records from the Habsburg court archives indicate that these positions were often hereditary, passed down through families who had served imperial households for multiple generations. The Klausner family, for instance, provided jesters to various Habsburg courts from approximately 1480 to 1580, with detailed payment records showing steady annual salaries, plus additional compensation for special performances during imperial diets and religious festivals. Germanic jesters faced unique challenges related to the fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike French or English jesters who served unified monarchies, Germanic court entertainers needed to navigate the complex relationships between emperors, electors, and various princely courts. The jester Hans Clauert, who served the Elector of Saxony during the 1540s, left behind a collection of letters that illuminate these difficulties. His correspondence, preserved in the Dresden State Archives, reveals constant negotiations over protocol when entertaining visiting dignitaries from other German territories, each with their own expectations for appropriate jester behavior. The Protestant Reformation created additional complications for Germanic jesters that their Catholic counterparts in France or England did not face. Courts that adopted Lutheran practices often restricted traditional carnival celebrations and religious parodies that had formed staple elements of jester performances. Electoral Saxony, for example, issued ordinances in 1525 that specifically prohibited jesters from performing satirical representations of saints or religious ceremonies. This forced Germanic jesters to develop new forms of entertainment focused on secular themes, leading to innovations in political satire and social commentary that influenced jester traditions throughout Northern Europe. Regional variations also extended to the physical appearance and costuming of jesters across different traditions. French court records include detailed inventories of jester garments, revealing preferences for elaborate silk costumes in multiple colors, often featuring intricate embroidery depicting classical mythological scenes. The wardrobe accounts of Louis XII's jester, Caillet, list expenditures for garments decorated with images of Mercury and Apollo, reinforcing the French emphasis on classical learning and literary sophistication. These costumes were regularly updated according to changing court fashions, with some French jesters receiving new outfits quarterly. English jester costumes, by contrast, emphasized practicality and versatility over elaborate decoration. Surviving examples from the Tower of London collections show that English jesters typically wore sturdy wool garments designed for active performance, including tumbling and musical presentations. The famous motley pattern associated with English jesters, irregular patches of different colored fabric, appears to have developed from practical considerations rather than symbolic meaning, allowing for easy repair and replacement of worn sections without requiring complete costume renewal. Germanic jester costumes reflected the military culture prevalent in many German courts, often incorporating elements derived from soldiers' uniforms or hunting attire. Archaeological evidence from burial sites associated with court servants includes metal bells and decorative elements that appear designed for attachment to military-style leather jerkins. This martial influence extended to jester performances with Germanic traditions, including more physical comedy and mock combat displays compared to the verbal wit emphasized in French courts or the musical entertainment favored in English settings. The relationship between jesters and religious authorities varied significantly across these regional traditions, creating different parameters for acceptable performance content. French jesters operated within a largely unified Catholic framework that provided clear, if restrictive, guidelines for religious humor. The Sorbonne issued periodic pronouncements regarding appropriate boundaries for religious comedy, and court records show that French jesters generally adhered to these limitations, focusing their satirical attention on secular targets rather than challenging religious doctrine directly. English jesters navigated the complex religious changes of the Tudor period, adapting their performances to accommodate shifts between Catholic and Protestant practices under different monarchs. Contemporary accounts describe how Tarleton modified his repertoire during Mary I's Catholic restoration, eliminating material that had mocked papal authority while introducing new songs that satirized Protestant reformers. This adaptability reflected the English jester tradition's emphasis on personal loyalty to individual monarchs rather than adherence to broader institutional principles, allowing for greater flexibility in response to changing political circumstances. This flexibility in performance content, while essential for professional survival, represented only one aspect of the complex economic relationship between jesters and their royal employers. The financial arrangements governing court entertainment in medieval and early modern Europe varied considerably across different kingdoms, with compensation structures reflecting both the perceived value of entertainment and the broader economic conditions of individual courts. In the French court during the reign of Louis XI, who ruled from 1461 to 1483, records from the Chambre des Comptes indicate that the king's principal jester, known as caillette, received an annual stipend of approximately 240 livres tournois, a sum equivalent to the yearly wages of a skilled craftsman in Paris during the same period. This compensation placed court jesters within the middle ranks of royal household servants, below the major officers of state, but above ordinary domestic staff. The regularity of these payments, documented in surviving account books from the royal treasury, suggests that entertainment was considered an essential court function rather than an occasional luxury. Contemporary records from the English Exchequer rolls reveal similar compensation patterns during the Tudor period. Will Sommers, Henry VIII's favoured fool, received an annual payment of £20 sterling, beginning in 1535, along with additional allowances for clothing and lodging within royal residences. This amount represented a substantial income for the period, considering that agricultural labourers typically earned between £3 and £4 annually. The privy purse expenses of Henry VIII, meticulously recorded by court officials, also show frequent smaller payments to Sommers for specific performances or entertainment during royal progresses to various English counties. The economic value placed on court entertainment becomes particularly evident when examining the additional benefits provided to royal jesters beyond their basic salaries. In the court of Emperor Maximilian I, who reigned over the Holy Roman Empire from 1493 to 1519, the imperial fool Kunz von der Rosen received not only monetary compensation but also grants of land in Lower Austria, generating rental income that provided long-term financial security. These property grants, documented in imperial charters preserved in the Vienna State Archives, indicate that successful court entertainers could achieve considerable wealth and social mobility through their positions. The compensation structure for court jesters also reflected the seasonal nature of much medieval court life. During the winter months, when courts remained in primary residences and formal entertainment was most frequent, jesters typically received their full stipends, along with comprehensive room and board. However, during summer campaigns or royal progresses, payment arrangements often shifted to per diem allowances that varied according to the specific requirements of travel and performance. Account records from the court of Charles V of France, dating to the 1370s, show his jester Heinz Llewellyn receiving reduced payments during military campaigns, but supplementary bonuses when required to perform for visiting dignitaries or foreign ambassadors. The economics of court entertainment extended beyond individual jester compensation to encompass broader patterns of cultural investment by medieval rulers. Italian city-states during the Renaissance period provide particularly detailed documentation of these expenditures through their sophisticated banking and accounting systems. The court of Ferrara under Duke Ercole I d'Este, who ruled from 1471 to 1505, maintained comprehensive records showing annual entertainment expenses that included not only jester salaries, but also costs for costumes, musical instruments, and elaborate staging for court performances. These financial records reveal that the Duke of Ferrara allocated approximately 8% of total court expenses to entertainment-related activities, a proportion that historians believe was typical among wealthy Italian courts of the period. The court's principal buffoon, known in documents simply as gonella, received annual compensation of 150 gold ducats, supplemented by clothing allowances and periodic bonuses for exceptional performances during diplomatic receptions. Similar expenditure patterns appear in the account books of the Medici court in Florence, where Lorenzo de' Medici maintained several entertainers on permanent retainer during the 1480s. The relationship between jester compensation and broader economic conditions becomes particularly apparent during periods of financial constraint or political instability. During the 100 Years' War, French royal account books show significant reductions in entertainment expenditures, with jester salaries often delayed or reduced by half during particularly difficult military campaigns. The court of Charles VI, whose reign from 1380 to 1422 encompassed some of the most challenging periods of the conflict with England, demonstrates this pattern clearly through surviving treasury records that show irregular payments to court entertainers throughout the early 15th century. Conversely, periods of economic prosperity and political stability typically coincided with increased investment in court entertainment. The court of Burgundy under Philip the Good, who ruled from 1419 to 1467, became renowned throughout Europe for its elaborate ceremonies and entertainment, supported by the duchy's considerable wealth from textile production and trade. Court records indicate that Philip maintained at least 3 permanent jesters, each receiving substantial annual stipends, along with elaborate costumes that often cost more than their yearly salaries. The compensation of court jesters also reflected their unique position within the complex hierarchy of medieval court society. Unlike other entertainers who might be hired for specific occasions, permanent court fools occupied a distinctive social niche that combined elements of both servant and confidant relationships with their royal employers. This ambiguous status influenced their economic arrangements, often providing them with privileges and perquisites unavailable to other court personnel of similar formal rank. Documentation from the court of James IV of Scotland, who reigned from 1488 to 1513, illustrates this privileged position through records showing his jester receiving not only regular monetary payments, but also the right to claim specific portions of food and wine from royal banquets. These traditional privileges, known as customary rights, could represent significant additional value beyond formal salary arrangements. The Lord Treasurer's accounts for the Scottish court during this period indicate that such customary benefits might increase a jester's effective compensation by as much as 50% above their nominal wages. The international nature of medieval court culture also influenced jester compensation patterns as rulers competed to attract and retain the most skilled entertainers. The court of Edward IV of England, ruling from 1461 to 1483, actively recruited entertainers from continental courts, offering enhanced compensation packages to attract performers with established reputations. Treasury records show payments to several foreign jesters during Edward's reign, including a Flemish entertainer known as Peter the Fool, who received double the standard English court rate, along with additional allowances for his foreign status. This competitive dynamic for entertainment talent appears throughout European court records of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Habsburg courts, with their extensive territorial holdings across Europe, maintained networks of entertainers who traveled between different royal residences according to seasonal requirements and diplomatic necessities. Account books from the court of Charles V show complex payment arrangements for entertainers who served in multiple locations, with compensation adjusted according to local economic conditions and currency fluctuations across the emperor's diverse territories. The economic relationship between courts and their entertainers also encompass longer-term considerations of retirement and old age provision. Unlike modern employment arrangements, medieval service relationships typically included implicit obligations for lifetime support of loyal servants. Court records from various European kingdoms show former jesters receiving continued payments or pension arrangements after their active performing years had ended. The English Exchequer Rolls document several such arrangements, including continued payments to aging court fools who had served multiple monarchs across several decades. These pension arrangements reflected both practical considerations and the personal relationships that often developed between rulers and their long-serving entertainers. The court of Louis XI of France provides a notable example through records showing continued support for his former jester Caillet, even after the entertainer had become too infirm for regular performance duties. Such arrangements demonstrated the value placed on loyalty and long service, while also ensuring that aging entertainers would not face destitution after their performing careers ended. These pension arrangements were not merely acts of royal benevolence, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of court dynamics and the need to maintain institutional knowledge. Records from the court of Charles V of Spain indicate that retired jesters often served as informal advisors on matters of court entertainment and protocol, their years of observation having made them keenly aware of noble sensitivities and preferences. The jester Francesilio de Zúñiga, who served Charles V during the 1520s, maintained correspondence with court officials well into the 1540s, providing recommendations for new entertainers and advice on managing the complex personality dynamics of visiting dignitaries. The personal relationship between a jester and their patron often transcended the formal boundaries of entertainer and audience. Historical accounts from the court of James I of England describe how the king's jester, Tom Derry, was granted unusual access to private royal chambers and family gatherings, privileges typically reserved for the highest-ranking courtiers. Contemporary letters written by court observers note that Derry was present during informal discussions of state matters, though his role was apparently limited to providing comic relief rather than substantive input on policy decisions. This intimate access created a unique dynamic where jesters possessed detailed knowledge of royal personalities and private affairs while being expected to maintain absolute discretion about such matters. The patronage system that supported court jesters varied considerably, depending on the wealth and organizational structure of individual courts. In the prosperous Burgundian court of Philip the Good during the mid-15th century, records indicate that the ducal jester received not only regular monetary payments, but also grants of land, clothing allowances, and housing within the ducal residences. The account books maintained by the Burgundian treasurer show payments to the jester's household staff, suggesting that successful court entertainers could maintain their own small retinues. This level of support reflected the significant value placed on skilled entertainment in one of Europe's wealthiest courts, where elaborate festivals and ceremonies served important diplomatic and political functions. Less wealthy courts necessarily provided more modest support for their jesters, though even minor nobles understood the value of maintaining some form of entertainment. The household accounts of the Earl of Northumberland from the early 16th century detail payments to a court fool described simply as Robert the Jester, who received regular wages equivalent to those paid to skilled craftsmen in the Earl's service. These records also show occasional bonus payments during major feast days and when important guests visited the estate, indicating that jesters' compensation often fluctuated based on their workload and the social calendar of their patrons. The personal dynamics between jesters and nobility were complicated by the inherently hierarchical nature of medieval and Renaissance society. While jesters enjoyed certain privileges and informal intimacies with their patrons, they remained fundamentally dependent on noble favor for their livelihood and social position. Contemporary accounts describe the delicate balance that successful jesters maintained between familiarity and deference, using humor to comment on their patrons' behavior while avoiding serious offense that might result in dismissal or punishment. Documentation from the court of Emperor Maximilian I provides insight into how these relationships evolved over time. The emperor's jester, Kunz von der Rosen, served at the imperial court for more than 2 decades, beginning in the 1490s. Early records describe him as a traditional fool who provided comic entertainment during formal occasions, but later documents suggest that his role expanded to include more sophisticated forms of social commentary and even informal diplomatic functions. Letters between Maximilian and various German princes occasionally reference humorous observations made by Kunz, indicating that his comments had become part of the emperor's regular discourse about court politics and international relations. The phenomenon of inherited jester positions reveals another dimension of the patronage relationship. In several European courts, the role of jester became effectively hereditary, passed down through families that had established long-standing relationships with particular noble houses. The Seckert family served as jesters to the Dukes of Württemberg for multiple generations during the 16th century, with detailed records showing how each successive jester adapted the traditional role to suit the personalities and preferences of new ducal patrons. This continuity provided stability for both the entertainers and their noble employers, ensuring that institutional knowledge about court customs and preferences was preserved across generational transitions. The economic aspects of jester patronage extended beyond simple wage payments to include various forms of indirect compensation. Court records from multiple locations describe jesters receiving gifts of clothing, often in distinctive colors or styles, that mark their special status within the court hierarchy. The wardrobe accounts of Henry VIII show regular expenditures for the clothing of Will Sommers, including the famous parti-colored garments that became associated with the jester's role. These clothing allowances served both practical and symbolic functions, ensuring that jesters were appropriately dressed for court appearances while visually distinguishing them from other courtiers. Travel expenses represented another significant aspect of jester patronage, particularly for entertainers who accompanied their patrons on diplomatic missions or extended progresses through their territories. The account books of Francis I of France detail payments for the travel and lodging expenses of his jester Triboulet, during the king's various campaigns and diplomatic journeys in the 1520s and 1530s. These records indicate that jesters were often considered essential members of royal traveling parties, their entertainment value being deemed necessary for maintaining morale and providing appropriate diversions during long journeys or tense negotiations. The relationship between jesters and noble patrons was further complicated by the entertainer's interactions with other members of the court hierarchy. Successful jesters needed to navigate relationships not only with their primary patrons, but also with courtiers, servants, and visiting dignitaries who might take offense at inappropriate humor or feel threatened by the jester's privileged access to the ruler. Contemporary accounts describe various conflicts that arose when jesters overstepped social boundaries or became involved in court factional disputes. The memoirs of courtiers from the court of Louis XII of France describe tensions between the king's jester and certain high-ranking nobles who resented the entertainer's informal influence and apparent immunity from normal social constraints. Documentation from the English court during the reign of Elizabeth I illustrates how gender dynamics affected the patronage relationship between rulers and their entertainers. While Elizabeth maintained no official court jester, records indicate that she provided patronage to various entertainers and wit makers who filled similar functions. The Queen's relationship with the comedian Richard Tarleton demonstrates how the traditional jester-patron dynamic adapted to accommodate a female ruler's need to maintain dignity and authority while still enjoying the benefits of court entertainment. Letters from courtiers describe Tarleton's careful approach to entertaining the Queen, avoiding the familiar banter that male jesters might have employed with male rulers. The geographical mobility that characterized many jester careers created complex webs of patronage relationships that extended beyond single courts. Records indicate that skilled entertainers sometimes maintained connections with multiple noble houses, providing services during specific seasons or events while building networks of support that could sustain them through periods of political uncertainty. The career of Scogin, who served various English noble houses during the late 15th century, illustrates this pattern of diversified patronage. Account books from several different estates show payments to Scogin for entertainment services, suggesting that he managed to maintain relationships with multiple patrons simultaneously, rather than committing exclusively to a single household. The decline of the traditional jester role during the 17th century can be traced partly through changing patterns of noble patronage and evolving court cultures. As Renaissance courts became more formalized and protocol-conscious, the informal privileges and intimate access that had characterized earlier jester-patron relationships became increasingly incompatible with new standards of royal dignity and administrative efficiency. The memoirs of courtiers from the court of Louis XIV describe how the Sun King's emphasis on elaborate ceremony and rigid hierarchy left little room for the spontaneous humor and casual familiarity that had defined earlier jester traditions. Economic factors also contributed to the transformation of jester patronage during this period. The increasing costs of court life and the growing complexity of state administration meant that noble households had less disposable income for entertainment expenses that were not directly related to political or diplomatic objectives. Account books from various 17th century courts show declining expenditures for traditional court entertainers, with resources being redirected toward more elaborate musical performances, theatrical productions, and other forms of entertainment that better served the ceremonial needs of increasingly centralized monarchical states. This economic shift toward more formalized entertainment reflected broader changes in court culture that were fundamentally reshaping the role of traditional entertainers throughout Europe. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 had established new principles of state sovereignty that influenced how monarchs presented themselves both domestically and internationally. Court ceremonies became increasingly codified and ritualistic, following strict protocols that left little room for the spontaneous wit and irreverent commentary that had characterized medieval jesters. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles, which reached its height of influence in the 1670s and 1680s, exemplified this new approach to royal entertainment, where every aspect of performance was carefully choreographed to reinforce the divine right of kings and the absolute nature of monarchical authority. The rise of professional theatre companies further marginalized court jesters by providing alternative forms of entertainment that were perceived as more sophisticated and culturally refined. The Comédie Française, established in 1680, represented the institutionalization of theatrical performance in a way that made the informal entertainment provided by court jesters seem antiquated by comparison. Similar developments occurred across Europe, with the establishment of permanent theatre companies in major cities, creating new opportunities for professional entertainers who could offer more elaborate and technically sophisticated performances than individual court jesters. Educational reforms and the influence of humanist philosophy also contributed to changing attitudes toward court entertainment. The expansion of formal education among the nobility meant that aristocratic audiences were increasingly familiar with classical literature, philosophy, and rhetoric, making them less receptive to the simple wordplay and physical comedy that had been staples of jester performances. University-educated courtiers, particularly those trained in institutions like Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, and various German universities, began to view traditional jester entertainment as intellectually beneath their station. This shift in cultural values was particularly pronounced in England, following the Restoration of 1660, when Charles II's court adopted many French customs and standards that emphasized literary sophistication over folk humor. The influence of the scientific revolution, which gained momentum throughout the 17th century, also played a role in diminishing the cultural relevance of court jesters. The emphasis on empirical observation and rational inquiry promoted by figures such as Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and later Isaac Newton created intellectual environments where traditional forms of entertainment based on superstition, folk wisdom, and unconventional behavior seemed increasingly out of place. Court conversations increasingly focused on natural philosophy, mathematics, and empirical discoveries, rather than the riddles, folk tales, and satirical observations that had been the stock in trade of medieval jesters. Religious developments during this period also contributed to the decline of court jesters, particularly in Protestant regions where Reformed theology emphasized moral seriousness and spiritual discipline. The influence of Puritan thought, even in courts that remained officially Anglican or Lutheran, created cultural atmospheres that were less tolerant of the irreverent humor and satirical commentary that had characterized jester performances. The English Commonwealth period from 1649 to 1660 had demonstrated how thoroughly religious reformers could suppress traditional forms of entertainment, and even after the Restoration, many courts remained cautious about entertainment that might be perceived as morally questionable or politically subversive. The professionalization of court administration during the early modern period meant that many of the informal relationships that had sustained court jesters were gradually replaced by more formal bureaucratic structures. The development of professional civil service systems, particularly in France, under Jean-Baptiste Colbert's administrative reforms in the 1660s and 1670s, created court environments where access to royal attention was increasingly mediated through official channels rather than personal relationships. Court jesters, who had traditionally relied on their ability to gain informal access to rulers and their immediate circles, found themselves excluded from increasingly formalized court hierarchies that prioritized official rank and bureaucratic function over personal entertainment value. Economic historians have noted that the cost-benefit analysis of maintaining court jesters became increasingly unfavorable as courts grew larger and more complex. A single jester who might have provided adequate entertainment for a medieval court of 50 or 60 people could not effectively serve the entertainment needs of early modern courts that might include several hundred courtiers, ambassadors, and administrative officials. The economies of scale favored larger, more elaborate forms of entertainment, such as orchestral performances, theatrical productions, and formal balls that could engage entire court communities simultaneously. Account records from the court of Leopold I in Vienna, who reigned from 1658 to 1705, show a clear pattern of declining expenditures for individual entertainers and increasing investments in ensemble performances and elaborate ceremonial events. The changing nature of royal residences also contributed to the decline of court jesters by creating physical environments that were less conducive to the intimate, informal entertainment that jesters had traditionally provided. The construction of elaborate palace complexes such as Versailles, Schönbrunn, and various Baroque residences throughout Germany created formal architectural spaces designed for ceremonial functions rather than the smaller, more intimate gatherings where jesters had traditionally performed. The grand salons and formal reception halls of these palaces were acoustically and spatially suited for orchestral music and theatrical performances rather than the conversational wit and intimate storytelling that had been characteristic of jester entertainment. Documentary evidence from various European courts indicates that by the 1680s, Many rulers had begun to view court jesters as relics of a less sophisticated era. Diplomatic correspondence from the period frequently comments on courts that still maintained traditional jesters as being behind the times or provincial in their entertainment choices. The French ambassador to the court of Christian V of Denmark, writing in 1684, noted with apparent disdain that the Danish court still employed a traditional fool whose performances seemed more suited to the age of our grandfathers than to the refined sensibilities of modern courtly society. Such comments reflect the growing perception that maintaining court jesters was a sign of cultural backwardness rather than entertainment sophistication. The Wars of the Spanish Succession, which began in 1701, marked a particularly significant period in the decline of court jesters, as the financial demands of prolonged military conflict forced many European courts to eliminate expenditures that were not considered essential to state functions. Military historians have documented how the enormous costs of maintaining armies and conducting siege warfare throughout the early 18th century led to systematic reductions in court entertainment budgets across Europe. The court of Emperor Joseph I, for example, dismissed most of its traditional entertainers in 1703 to redirect resources toward military expenses, a pattern that was repeated in numerous other European courts during this period. The influence of French cultural standards continued to spread throughout Europe during the early 18th century, further marginalizing courts that maintained traditional forms of entertainment, such as jesters. The adoption of French as the language of international diplomacy meant that courtiers throughout Europe were expected to be familiar with French literary and cultural standards, which emphasized wit, elegance, and sophisticated conversation over the more boisterous and physical forms of entertainment associated with traditional jesters. German courts, in particular, underwent significant Francification during this period, with rulers such as Augustus II of Saxony and Frederick I of Prussia adopting French entertainment standards that left little place for traditional German court entertainers. By the 1720s, historical records suggest that court jesters had virtually disappeared from major European courts, surviving only in some smaller German principalities and in certain regional courts that maintained more traditional approaches to entertainment. The court of Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse-Darmstadt, for example, continued to employ what contemporary sources describe as a traditional court fool until approximately 1724. But such positions had become increasingly rare and were generally viewed as provincial curiosities rather than legitimate forms of court entertainment. Even in these remaining cases, the role of court entertainer had evolved significantly from the medieval model, with performers focusing more on music and conventional comedy rather than the satirical commentary and unconventional behavior that had characterized their medieval predecessors. The emergence of coffee house culture in major European cities during this period provided alternative venues for the type of satirical commentary and social criticism that had once been the province of court jesters. Establishments such as Lloyd's Coffee House in London, which opened in 1686, and similar venues in Paris, Vienna, and other major cities became centers for political discussion and social commentary that operated outside the formal structures of court society. These new social spaces attracted many of the performers and satirists who might previously have sought positions as court entertainers, offering them audiences that were often more receptive to irreverent humor and social criticism than the increasingly formal atmosphere of 18th century courts. The institutionalization of theatrical entertainment continued to provide alternative career paths for performers who possessed the skills that had traditionally been associated with court jesters. The establishment of regular theatrical seasons in major cities meant that talented comedians and satirical performers could pursue professional careers that offered greater financial security and artistic freedom than the increasingly restricted role of court entertainer. Theatre companies such as the King's Company and the Duke's Company in London provided employment opportunities for performers who could adapt their skills to the requirements of formal dramatic productions rather than the informal entertainment that had characterized jester performances. The gradual institutionalization of theatrical entertainment during the late 17th and early 18th centuries created a fundamental shift in how comedic performers related to their audiences and patrons. Where medieval jesters had operated within the intimate confines of noble households, developing personal relationships with their employers that could span decades, the new theatrical system emphasized public performance before anonymous audiences. This transformation meant that the traditional jester's ability to offer direct counsel through humor, to serve as a confidential advisor disguised as an entertainer, became largely obsolete. Records from the period indicate that by approximately 1720, the last recognizable court jesters in major European courts had either transitioned to other roles or had simply not been replaced upon their deaths. The evolution of the jester figure during this period can be traced through various cultural adaptations that emerged across different European societies. In France, the Commedia dell'arte tradition, which had flourished since the 16th century, began to incorporate many of the satirical elements that had previously been the exclusive domain of court jesters. Performers such as Giuseppe Domenico Biancolelli, who worked in Paris from 1662 until his death in 1688, exemplified this transition by developing characters that combined the improvisational wit of traditional jesters with the more structured dramatic requirements of theatrical performance. His portrayal of Arlecchino, or Harlequin, preserved many of the subversive qualities that had characterized medieval fool figures, while adapting them to the expectations of paying theatre audiences. In England, the transformation of jester traditions manifested differently, particularly through the development of what historians term the stage fool in Shakespearean and post-Shakespearean drama. While Shakespeare's fools, such as those in King Lear and Twelfth Night, had been written during the final flowering of the actual court jester tradition in the early 1600s, later theatrical works continued to draw upon the archetype in increasingly stylized forms. Playwrights such as William Congreve, writing in the 1690s, and later Richard Brinsley Sheridan, whose major works appeared in the 1770s, created comedic characters that retained the jester's traditional role as social commentator, while removing the personal relationship with nobility that had defined the medieval position. These theatrical adaptations allowed audiences to experience the subversive humor that jesters had once provided to individual courts, but within the safer confines of fictional narrative. The emergence of coffee house culture in major European cities during the early 18th century created another venue for the transformation of jester-like entertainment. Establishments such as Will's Coffee House in London, which operated from approximately 1671 to 1712, and the Café Procope in Paris, founded in 1686, became gathering places where satirical performers could practice their craft before educated urban audiences. These venues fostered the development of what contemporaries called coffee house wits, performers who specialized in impromptu satirical commentary on political and social events. Unlike medieval jesters who had been protected by their official positions within noble households, these coffee house entertainers operated in a more precarious environment, relying on public approval and voluntary contributions rather than guaranteed patronage. The development of periodical literature during the early 18th century provided another outlet for the satirical sensibilities that had previously been channeled through jester performances. Publications such as the Tatler, which began publication in 1709 under the direction of Richard Steele, and The Spectator, launched by Steele and Joseph Addison in 1711, employed many of the same techniques of social observation and gentle mockery that had characterized the best jester performances. These publications allowed writers to assume personas that functioned much like literary jesters, offering commentary on contemporary society while maintaining enough distance from direct political involvement to avoid serious consequences. The anonymous or pseudonymous nature of much periodical writing during this era paralleled the traditional jester's ability to speak truths that might be dangerous if voiced by others. Continental European societies experienced similar transformations, though with distinctive regional characteristics that reflected local political and cultural conditions. In German-speaking territories, the tradition of court jesters persisted somewhat longer than in Western Europe, partly due to the fragmented nature of political authority in the Holy Roman Empire. Records indicate that several minor German courts continued to employ traditional jesters until approximately the 1750s, though their roles had become increasingly ceremonial rather than genuinely advisory. The court of Frederick the Great of Prussia, for example, maintained what contemporaries described as fool-like entertainers until the 1760s, though these performers functioned more as exotic curiosities than as the trusted counselors that medieval jesters had often become. The transformation of jester traditions in Eastern Europe followed different patterns influenced by the region's distinct political structures and cultural traditions. In Poland, the tradition of court entertainers, known as błazens, persisted into the 18th century, though their functions became increasingly aligned with those of musicians and storytellers rather than satirical commentators. The court of Augustus II of Poland, who ruled from 1697 to 1733, reportedly employed several performers whose roles combined elements of traditional jesting with the musical entertainment that was becoming more fashionable in European courts. Similarly, in Russia, the court of Peter the Great included entertainers who fulfilled some traditional jester functions, though the Tsar's preference for Western European customs meant that these positions were gradually replaced by more conventional theatrical entertainment. The influence of Enlightenment, thinking on European intellectual culture during the 18th century, created both opportunities and challenges for the preservation of jester-like traditions. Elements of the original jester role could be identified in numerous contemporary cultural forms, from professional comedy to political journalism to folk festivals. But none of these modern manifestations could fully recreate the unique social and political functions that had characterized the medieval court jester. The intimate relationship between jester and patron, the balance of entertainment and counsel, the protection offered by official position combined with the freedom to speak uncomfortable truths. These essential characteristics belong to a social and political world that had long since disappeared. The medieval court jester had been a figure uniquely suited to the hierarchical, personal nature of feudal and early modern political systems. As European societies evolved toward more democratic, impersonal, and bureaucratic forms of governance, the specific niche that court jesters had occupied gradually disappeared. The functions they had served were redistributed among various new institutional forms: professional entertainers, journalists, satirical writers, political commentators, each preserving certain elements of the original role while adapting to new social and technological contexts. What remains of the medieval jester today exists mainly in fragments, in the knowing smile of a political cartoonist, in the gentle mockery of a late-night television host, in the paradoxical wisdom attributed to fictional fools in literature and film. These scattered elements preserve something of the jester's spirit, but like echoes in an empty hall, they remind us more of what has been lost than of what has been preserved. The medieval court jester, that figure who could speak truth to power through the protective veil of laughter, who could offer counsel through contradiction, who could criticize through apparent praise, gradually fades into the mists of historical memory, leaving behind only traces of influence in the entertainment forms and critical traditions of later centuries. Their legacy lives on, transformed and adapted, but never quite the same, never quite as intimate, never quite as dangerous, never quite as necessary, as it once had been in those distant courts where wisdom wore bells and truth spoke in riddles. And so the jester's story ends not with a dramatic flourish, but with a gentle transformation, a gradual dissolution into other forms, other voices, other ways of speaking the difficult truths that every society needs to hear, but perhaps can never quite hear clearly enough. Thank you for studying with the Sleep Scholar. May your dreams be filled with quiet knowledge. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next lesson.